Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Welcome to the channel. If this is your first time, this is a bit of a surprise video. So I was looking through the Twilight Zone companion, which I had used previously for the deep dive videos I've been doing about the Twilight Zone, having read it over the years many times. But then I was reminded of something that I thought I'd look up to see where I could find it, and it's on YouTube. And this is Rod Serling's reworking of A Christmas Carol. It's an amazing thing that Rod Serling did his own version of A Christmas Carol. So I love the story of The Christmas Carol. I love looking for different interpretations. I had forgotten, I've read that book so many times, I clearly had forgotten that it existed. And I thought I'd give it another look to see if it was on any of the streaming services. And it's on YouTube. So I'm going to link the YouTube version in the description once you're seeing this, if you're curious to watch it. But there's actually two versions on YouTube, and one's a little bit lower quality than the other one. So I'll link the one that's really, really good quality, and it's really been cleaned up really nice. So this was in 1964. So the Twilight Zone original series ran from 1959 to 1964, 5 seasons. And this special Christmas Carol that Rod Serling wrote, which was called A Carol for Another Christmas, this was commissioned by the United Nations. And it was kind of seen as a bit of propaganda for pushing the principles and ideology of countries coming together. And basically, the initial springboard was like an anti-isolationist kind of message. There's a lot more in this than just that, but that was the idea that the United Nations wanted to put across when they commissioned this to happen. And Rod Serling wrote this fantastic treatment, playing with the plot and the characters and the message of A Christmas Carol from Dickens into this new version that is pretty much basically anti-war, anti-nuclear war, anti-capitalist, and anti-isolationist as well. Anti-isolationist. Well, I can't say that. That's the general gist of it. But it's such an interesting thing because I should probably point out, you might have found this video and not know much about the context with Rod Serling and the Twilight Zone. So Rod Serling was the man behind the Twilight Zone. He wrote most of the episodes. It was his idea. It came from him being really passionate about making TV drama really thoughtful and maturely written. And he thought TV was a great medium for great dialogue and great scripts and great ideas and thought-provoking drama. And he was really successful with something he wrote called Requiem for a Heavyweight, which is a drama play, a teleplay about a boxer, and that was when he was given the green light to do the Twilight Zone, and that just got really, really popular. So the Twilight Zone is a part of our culture, but it got really popular and really, really famous and acclaimed during that first run of 5 seasons. So it's not one of those things that got really famous and popular and influential after the fact. It was really big at the time. So this coming out now in 1964 is interesting because this version of A Christmas Carol comes out after that initial run of the Twilight Zone. So he was already a big name. So it would have mattered that he decided to do this. I mean, ironically, the show, ABC and Rod Serling himself and the United Nations got loads of complaints from the public because it's so on the nose, it was so controversial, and it was so blatant with its message, and it upset some people, which is kind of interesting. It's got a really massive cast as well, so I want to talk about the cast for a minute. So the main character, the Scrooge character, is played by Sterling Hayden. But all the way through this film, this TV movie, you've got all sorts of people. You've got Percy Rodriguez, who's been tons and tons of stuff. He plays a really important role at the end. Ben Gazzara, who you might know as the kind of the villain in Roadhouse. Peter Sellers, who does an incredible performance at the end, really powerful performance at the end, but kind of like a clown character. But I'll get to him later on. And Yves Saint Marie, and Britt Eklund, and Robert Shaw does a fantastic performance. Pat Hingle as well. You know, so many people. It's really interesting. And funnily enough, Peter Fonda was actually cast as Sterling Hayden's son, which and his son is kind of the initial impetus for the whole thing. His son's called Marley, and the ghost of Marley, the ghost of his dead son, is the springboard for the whole story. But they cut the scenes with Peter Fonda in it, so that was kind of weird. So he is there as a ghostly figure, but he had actual scenes with lines in it, but they cut them out. So I'll just explain what the plot is. It's such an interesting thing, this is. So it's a reworking of... Oh, sorry, the one other thing I was going to say is that it was produced by Joseph Mankiewicz as well. And this is the only thing he ever did on TV. And he'd already been really famous for All About Eve and a bunch of other films. And he ends up having a huge career the last decades. That you know he's one of the really major names in Hollywood. So it's interesting that he was behind this as well. So anyway, Sterling Hayden plays this right-wing ex-military businessman. He's got a lot of power at this point, and quite early on, in sort of first couple of scenes, you've got this big exchange with his nephew, who's played by Ben Gazzara, and basically he gets into this big debate about funding this international exchange program for this university that his nephew works at, and it's an ideological debate. It's an argument / row that is based on their own polar opposite ideological differences, and ultimately it's about Sterling Hayden's character, who's called Dan Grudge. Dan Grudge, he doesn't believe in letting a Polish teacher come over and have this cultural exchange, because he literally doesn't believe in any kind of international exchange system, any kind of like deal like that. And Ben Gazzara's character, his nephew, is arguing that this is a way forward. This is the best way to treat society, and it's a really interesting scene, but it's also very wordy. So it's very poetic. You know, like that. Sometimes the way Rod Serling writes, because you get this in the Twilight Zone as well, it's just really very dramatic lines that you'd never really naturally say, but it's really pointed and, as I say, quite poetic sometimes. And that first scene is probably the scene in the film that's the most heavy with the poetic dialogue. But I thought it was brilliant, a very sparkling dialogue, I thought. But as I said, not really that natural. And then later on, the dialogue gets more natural. So there's this big exchange, and he goes away with Sterling Hayden. The nephew goes away with Sterling Hayden telling his nephew that he's not going to fund this cultural exchange, and he very passionately and aggressively says we shouldn't be involved in other people's affairs and other countries' educational system and all that sort of stuff. And it sets up this resentment that he's got, that's based on his son dying as well. That's kind of like how he sort of flipped into this situation. So then he starts getting visited by the ghosts of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, and the ghost of Christmas future. Steve Lawrence plays the ghost of Christmas past. He does a really interesting and quite sarky performance, and he might be familiar to some people as the manager of the Blues Brothers. But he does a really good performance as the ghost of Christmas past, and that sequence is all based around war and the debate that Sterling Hayden's character has with the Ghost of Christmas Past is about the ideology of war, the setup of war, who fights it, how these things come about, whether they can be prevented. And it's a really fantastic scene where they're toing and froing on this political point. It's a really good political argument in that section. And then in the Ghost of Christmas Present, Pat Hingle, who you may know as someone who played Commissioner Gordon in the Tim Burton Batman film, the first Batman film. But in this one, he was quite a sort of goofy performance, quite an extrovert and comical in some ways performance, very exaggerated performance, but again making very serious political points about the inequality of wealth and hunger, famine, disease, medical inequality, stuff like that. It was really, really well done, and it was like visually juxtaposing this huge table with this sort of banquet on it next to these starving children that were all sort of barbed wired off. It was a really good scene, and again, you've got another political debate. Pat Hingle's Ghost of Christmas Present is arguing with him about the way that man creates inequality and doesn't have to. Fantastic stuff. And then the Ghost of Christmas Future, that was one of my favourite performances in it, which is by Robert Shaw. He takes him to the future where there's this really bizarre sort of post-nuclear scene that's based around this cult figure played by Peter Sellers, and he talks about the imperial me, and he's got them chanting me, 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 me. It's so. I love the way it's written, but some people might find it a little bit on the nose, a bit too direct, a bit too obvious. But I think some people lose nuance. So the way Rod Serling writes, a lot of the political Twilight Zone episodes are really direct, and the dialogue is full of very obvious statements and obvious metaphors sometimes. And this scene is really blatantly anti-individualism and thinking about society. It's very much like a socialist scene, and how it doesn't work to just think about that individualistic me thing all the time. And I think it's so interesting nowadays when we're in this sort of me generation, they call it, the selfie generation, and people are so wrapped up in themselves at the moment. And you've got like a political discourse happening now where people are safer to think about this isolationist idea, and why don't we take care of ourselves first, all that kind of stuff. So I feel like it's so poignant now to have this stuff happening. And Peter Sellers' performance is really, really good. He's got a Santa Claus outfit on and a cowboy hat, and the cowboy hat's got me written on it. And it's a really good performance. And interestingly enough, this came out in December 1964, and in January 1964, Sterling Hayden, who's playing the main character, and Peter Sellers were both in Dr. Strangelove, which is also a fantastic film, one of the most important films of the 60s, I think. Again, quite different performances, really. I mean, Peter Sellers plays 3 characters in it. But, yeah, they were both in this, which is interesting. But, yeah, amazing last scene, really powerful. And it ends with Sterling Hayden's character, Dan Grudge, on his knees, holding the cloak of Robert Shaw's Spirit of Christmas Future, saying, can we change this? Does it have to happen? Just like Scrooge does at the end of A Christmas Carol. And then, and obviously, by the end of it, he's a changed man. It's so interesting. And I just think I hadn't had a chance to see it. I had known about it before because I'd read about the film in the Twilight Zone Companion, but I had forgotten about it, and I was seeing it again. I thought, oh, I'll have a look to see how I can get it, because obviously nowadays you can find some old stuff on some streaming services, and there it was on YouTube. So I'll link it below. Definitely recommend you watch it. It's really, really interesting, and very, very Twilight Zone, very Rod Serling. If you like the way he writes, you'll love it. If you feel like sometimes he's a little bit too direct and it's too obvious what he makes people say, what he makes the characters say, then you might find it too much, maybe a bit irritating, but I loved it. I absolutely loved it, and I think sometimes you got to be that direct sometimes, and I absolutely fully agree with this messaging. You know, I think it's important points to make about capitalism and the nature of greed, the nature of inequality in not just in money but in food surplus as well, and I'm shocked that the debate about nuclear weapons and nuclear war is so naff nowadays, if there is a debate at all, and there is a clear and present danger of that kind of thing, and I just think it's so weird, and this film this film is very relevant now. It's very poignant, and I think it's a really interesting thing to watch. So yeah, if you're a fan, definitely recommend it. And if you're not a fan, give it a go, see what you think. It's on YouTube, so it's very easy to watch. A Carol from Another Season from 1964, written by Rod Serling. Thanks for watching. Stay curious, everybody.